The conference room smelled like fresh coffee and corporate betrayal. Rachel Montgomery stood at the head of the mahogany table in her $20,500 Armani suit, clicking through a PowerPoint slide that read Strategic Leadership Evolution, while I sat there knowing she was about to announce my termination in front of the entire cybersecurity division. I'm Andrew Hoffman, 52 years old, and I'd been watching this slow-motion execution for 6 months. It started when Rachel became CEO in January 2024. Stanford MBA, board connections through her father William Montgomery, all buzzwords and zero operational experience. Her first company meeting was about transforming legacy operational paradigms in defense contracting. When someone uses legacy as a dirty word in a room full of people who've been keeping government systems secure for decades, you know they're planning a purge. Meridian Defense Solutions wasn't some venture-funded startup. We held active contracts with NSA, DoD, and Homeland Security worth $53 million annually. Real work that kept Chinese hackers out of power grids and Iranian cyber warfare units away from water treatment systems. I'd rebuilt our entire threat analysis platform after the 2019 breach nearly bankrupted the company. My team and I had invested 8 years building something that actually worked. But Rachel didn't care about operational security. She cared about Forbes profiles and IPO preparation. The young CEO disrupts stodgy defense contractor narrative was worth more to her board presentation than the technical reality of protecting critical infrastructure. I should mention the financial pressure I was under. My divorce settlement required me to cover Jake's college expenses until graduation. Virginia Tech engineering program ran $31,000 annually, and Jake was entering his senior year in August. At 52, getting terminated meant 6 to 8 months scrambling for another defense contractor position, assuming they'd sponsor my top-secret clearance transfer. My current base salary was $185,000, but finding equivalent compensation in cybersecurity required either relocating to California or accepting a significant pay cut. The warning signs started in February. Rachel scheduled capability assessment meetings for our division without including me. I found out from Alex Turner, one of the junior engineers I'd trained, who mentioned it during a routine code review. When I asked Rachel about it, she gave me that MBA-programmed smile and said they were evaluating fresh approaches to threat mitigation. Fresh approaches. In cybersecurity. Like asking a philosophy major for fresh approaches to cardiac surgery. The red flags multiplied through spring. My name disappeared from Pentagon briefings I'd been leading since 2021. Client presentations suddenly had new technical leads. Rachel would nod politely when I explained zero-day exploit mitigation, then turn to her 26-year-old niece, Brooke Chambers, and ask what she thought about integrating artificial intelligence paradigms for the same vulnerabilities. Brooke had graduated USC in May 2023 with a communications degree. She'd been with Meridian for exactly 73 days when Rachel promoted her to Chief Innovation Officer. Her cybersecurity experience consisted of managing her sorority's social media accounts and occasionally calling IT support when her laptop wouldn't connect to Wi-Fi. But she was young, photogenic, and completely aligned with Rachel's vision of replacing institutional constraints with agile innovation. That was apparently sufficient qualification to interface with Pentagon procurement officers who'd been evaluating defense contractors since before PowerPoint existed. The breaking point came in May. We were preparing for our annual DoD Threat Assessment Review scheduled for June 18th. This wasn't a sales presentation, it was a technical evaluation that determined whether Pentagon would renew our primary cybersecurity contract worth $34 million annually. I'd been leading these reviews since 2020, walking general officers through threat matrices I'd personally architected. This year, Rachel scheduled the preparation meetings without informing me. "We're implementing a generational leadership transition," she explained when I confronted her in her corner office. "Brooke will be presenting the technical overview. You've created such comprehensive documentation that knowledge transfer should be seamless. I'd done more than document our capabilities. I'd designed every intrusion detection algorithm, every incident response protocol, every piece of threat intelligence architecture that made us valuable to DoD. But Rachel wanted her disruption narrative for the board meeting. "Rachel, Brooke doesn't understand the technical requirements," I said carefully. "These aren't commercial software demonstrations. Pentagon evaluators will ask specific questions about NIST compliance, threat vector analysis, and integration with classified systems." She leaned back in her executive chair, studying me like I was a legacy system requiring modernization. Andrew, I appreciate your institutional knowledge, but we need to demonstrate next-generation thinking to younger decision-makers in government procurement. Younger decision-makers. The Pentagon Cybersecurity Review Board averaged 47 years old with 22 years of combined military and civilian experience. They didn't want next-generation thinking. They wanted systems that functioned when Beijing launched coordinated attacks at 0300 hours. That afternoon, I made a call I'd been postponing for months. Norman Price, our general counsel, was a retired Navy commander who understood federal contracting regulations. Unlike Rachel's collection of business school consultants, Norman knew the difference between corporate restructuring and contractual obligations. Norman, I need to review the key personnel designations in our DoD contracts, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Specifically the continuity requirements. He pulled up our contract files, scrolling through amendments from our 2020 recertification process. After the 2019 data breach nearly destroyed the company, Pentagon had imposed stricter personnel accountability standards. Critical technical positions had to be designated by name in contract documentation. You couldn't replace the architect of classified systems without formal DoD notification and capability review. Here's the relevant section, Norman said, highlighting text on his monitor. FAR 52.2191 requires 180-day advance notification for any changes to key personnel. Early removal triggers automatic contract review unless replacement personnel demonstrate equivalent qualifications and security clearances. I was designated key personnel on 4 separate contracts totaling $47 million annually. Rachel had no idea these designations existed. What's the timeline for DoD to approve personnel changes? I asked. Norman frowned at the screen. Minimum 120 days for capability assessment, usually 6 to 9 months if they question our ability to maintain performance standards. He looked up. Why the interest in personnel regulations? Strategic planning, I said. Leadership transitions require careful coordination. That evening, I sat in my Alexandria kitchen calculating the mathematics of corporate warfare. Rachel wanted me eliminated before the June Pentagon review, but federal acquisition regulations had other plans. If she terminated my employment, DoD would suspend our contracts pending personnel review. 9 months without revenue renewals would bankrupt Meridian Defense. I started building my documentation file that weekend, compiling 8 years of system architecture designs, threat analysis protocols, and security implementations. Every algorithm bore my digital signature. Every threat mitigation framework traced back to my security clearance authorizations. If Rachel wanted a leadership evolution, she was about to discover why the previous generation wrote contracts so precisely. The Pentagon review was scheduled for June 18th at 1400 hours. Rachel had been promoting it for weeks, telling board members how Brooks' innovative perspective would demonstrate our evolution as a forward-thinking defense contractor. I wasn't invited to the preparation sessions, which began in earnest during the second week of May. Pete Sullivan, our senior external contractor, stopped by my office on May 15th. Pete had been supporting Pentagon cybersecurity evaluations since the Bush administration. He understood the difference between selling commercial software and protecting classified networks. Heard through channels that DoD is bringing heavy hitters next month, he said, settling into my visitor chair. General Morrison from Cyber Command, Deputy Director Walsh from NSA's Information Assurance Directorate, plus procurement officers from 3 different commands. What's their focus? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Deep technical evaluation. They want comprehensive review of our threat analysis platform, particularly the machine learning modules you developed after the Iranian supply chain attack last September, the Iranian incident. 6 months ago, Tehran-backed hackers had attempted penetrating DoD logistics networks through compromised hardware suppliers. Our system detected the intrusion within 47 seconds, automatically isolating affected nodes and alerting Pentagon security before any classified data was accessed. It was exactly the kind of performance that justified contract renewals. But the algorithms that stopped it were my architecture. The machine learning models were trained on threat data I'd compiled over 4 years. Brooke couldn't explain our detection methodology any more than she could derive quantum encryption principles. Does Rachel understand what they're evaluating? Pete asked. Rachel thinks cybersecurity is like marketing, I replied. Present some metrics, demonstrate user interfaces. Everyone approves the renewal. Monday, June 3rd, brought the inevitable crisis. Alex Turner appeared at my office door at 08:15 hours, laptop in hand, looking like he'd spent the weekend debugging failed code. "Andrew, we have a significant problem with the Pentagon presentation," he said, closing the door behind him. "Brooke asked me to prepare technical slides, but she wants everything simplified for broader accessibility." Simplified how? Alex opened his laptop, displaying Brooke's annotated presentation. She'd replaced detailed network architecture diagrams with stock photos of server rooms. Technical specifications were substituted with phrases like "enhanced threat detection" and "next-generation security solutions." She said Pentagon evaluators don't need to understand implementation details, Alex continued, just strategic value and operational outcomes. I examined the slides. Brooke had transformed a technical assessment into a venture capital pitch. The kind of presentation that impressed business school audiences who cared more about market positioning than actual functionality. Pentagon procurement officers would terminate the meeting within 10 minutes. "Alex, you understand these systems better than anyone except me," I said. "What happens when they ask about NIST 800-53 compliance frameworks? That's what concerns me." Brooke keeps discussing seamless integration and plug-and-play deployment. She doesn't comprehend that government networks aren't commercial cloud environments. Everything requires security certification, penetration testing, and approval through multiple authorization levels. We spent that morning reviewing what Brooke would actually encounter. Pentagon technical evaluations weren't boardroom presentations. They were comprehensive examinations conducted by people who'd been implementing cybersecurity since before PowerPoint existed. General Morrison held a computer science doctorate from West Point and had commanded cyber warfare units for 15 years. He didn't care about strategic vision. He wanted detailed explanations of how our intrusion detection algorithms identified previously unknown attack vectors. June 18th arrived with appropriate gravity. I watched from my office as Rachel, Brooke, and Brian Walsh loaded presentation materials into a black SUV for the drive to Pentagon City. Rachel wore her conference suit navy blue Armani that cost more than most federal employees earned monthly. Brooke carried a leather portfolio probably worth more than Alex's car payment. They looked like they were attending a technology conference, not a national security evaluation. The call came at 11:47 hours. Brian's voice transmitted through my desk speaker with barely controlled panic. "Andrew, we need you at the Pentagon immediately. Emergency situation developing. What's the specific problem? Just get here. Bring comprehensive technical documentation for the threat analysis platform." I found them in a Pentagon conference room that reeked of professional humiliation. Rachel was pacing behind her chair, jacket removed, hair disheveled from nervous gesturing. Brooke sat motionless at her laptop, staring at the screen with the expression of someone who'd just discovered physics had mathematical requirements. Norman Price was on conference call with Colonel Stevens from DoD Procurement. Even through the secure phone connection, tension was audible in the Pentagon official's voice. "What happened?" I asked. Rachel turned toward me with desperate eyes. "The presentation encountered some challenges. DoD has follow-up questions about our technical capabilities." "Challenges how?" Brian spoke first. Brooke couldn't answer questions about system architecture. When General Morrison asked about our machine learning threat classification algorithms, she discussed artificial intelligence and automation without explaining actual implementation methodologies. "They requested technical specifications," Rachel added. "Detailed documentation, source code samples, architecture diagrams proving we can deliver contracted capabilities." Colonel Stevens' voice cut through the room. "Meridian Defense has 72 hours to provide comprehensive technical documentation demonstrating current cybersecurity platform capabilities. Failure to provide adequate documentation will result in contract review status pending capability assessment." Contract review status. Pentagon's diplomatic way of saying we're evaluating whether to terminate your contracts. Norman cleared his throat. "Andrew, we need comprehensive technical documentation package. Everything DoD requires to verify our platform capabilities and compliance with federal cybersecurity standards." I surveyed the room, Rachel avoiding eye contact. Brooke still fixated on her laptop like it might provide salvation through divine intervention. Brian checking his smartphone, probably updating his resume. "I'll need complete system access and administrative privileges," I said. "Source code repositories, classified, documentation, everything." "Approved," Rachel said immediately. "Whatever you require, and I'll need to present the documentation personally. DoD won't accept technical explanations from someone who couldn't answer basic network security questions." Rachel's face drained color. Her entire narrative about generational leadership transformation was disintegrating in real time. If I had to rescue the Pentagon contract, everyone would understand who actually operated our cybersecurity division. Agreed, she said quietly. Just preserve the contract. I nodded, already formulating my approach. But I wasn't planning to preserve anything. I was planning to demonstrate exactly what happened when you attempted replacing institutional expertise with generational enthusiasm. The Pentagon was about to receive a very educational presentation about the difference between marketing presentations and cybersecurity implementation. I spent Thursday evening at the office, compiling 8 years of technical documentation, not to save the contract to prepare my exit strategy. Every algorithm I'd written, every system I'd architected, every protocol that kept government networks secure, all meticulously organized and backed up to encrypted drives stored in my home safe. Friday morning arrived with the artificial urgency of corporate crisis management. Rachel had scheduled an emergency all-hands meeting to address our collaborative response to DoD feedback. Translation: we're hemorrhaging credibility and need Andrew to stop the bleeding. The main conference room was standing room only. Our entire cybersecurity division, plus finance, legal, operations, and the complete board of directors. Rachel stood at the front, her usual confidence replaced by the careful movements of someone navigating a minefield. Yesterday's Pentagon evaluation highlighted communication optimization opportunities, she began, avoiding eye contact with Brooke, who sat in the back row looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. We're implementing immediate process improvements to ensure superior technical delivery. Corporate speak translation: Brooke embarrassed us, and now the grown-ups have to clean up. Andrew Hoffman will be leading our technical documentation response to DoD, Rachel continued. His comprehensive platform knowledge will demonstrate the capabilities that make Meridian Defense an essential cybersecurity partner. I stood slowly. Every face in the room turned toward me, some relieved, others concerned, a few openly calculating what this meant for their own positions. Before I prepare anything for DoD, I said calmly, I need clarification about my employment status. Rachel's practiced smile faltered. What do you mean, Andrew? Yesterday you asked me to rescue a $34 million contract. 3 weeks ago, you informed the board I was transitioning to an advisory consulting role. I need to understand whether I'm still VP of Cybersecurity Operations or just someone you call during emergencies. The room went silent. Board members exchanged glances. Norman Price opened his laptop, suddenly very interested in contract documentation. Andrew, this isn't appropriate timing for organizational discussions, Rachel said, voice tightening. Actually, it's perfect timing, I replied. DoD specifically requested technical documentation from our senior cybersecurity leadership. If I'm not senior leadership anymore, someone else needs to handle this. The implication hung in the air like nerve gas. Everyone knew what it meant. Brooke couldn't explain a basic firewall configuration, much less defend our platform architecture to Pentagon evaluators. Brian Walsh was competent with business systems, but he'd been focused on administrative technology for years. I was the only person in the room who could walk into the Pentagon and credibly discuss our cybersecurity capabilities without triggering additional scrutiny. Rachel attempted damage control. We're optimizing some organizational structures for efficiency, but your technical leadership remains absolutely essential. Optimizing how specifically? She glanced toward her father, who sat expressionless at the head of the board table. William Montgomery had founded Meridian Defense 30 years ago. He understood government contracting in ways his MBA daughter never would. We're developing a new position, Rachel said carefully. Chief Technical Officer for Government Relations. Enhanced compensation package, direct board reporting, complete autonomy over federal contract management, standard corporate maneuvering, a fancy title with no real authority, designed to keep me satisfied while she maintained control over strategic decisions. But it provided the opening I needed. I appreciate the consideration, I said. But before accepting any position changes, I need to review the implications with legal counsel, particularly regarding key personnel designations and federal compliance requirements. Norman's head snapped up from his laptop. He'd obviously been researching the same contract provisions I'd been studying for weeks. Andrew, perhaps we should discuss this privately, he said, recognizing exactly where this conversation was headed. No need for privacy, I replied. It's a straightforward question. If my employment status changes, what happens to our DoD contracts? Board members started whispering among themselves. Rachel looked increasingly panicked as she realized she'd walked into a carefully constructed trap. Norman? William Montgomery's voice cut through the murmurs. What are the federal contract implications? Norman cleared his throat, reading from his screen. Current DoD agreements designate Andrew Hoffman as key personnel for classified operations under FR 52.2191. Any modification to his employment status requires 180-day advance notification to the Department of Defense and formal capability review. How long does capability review typically require? Asked Margaret Chen, the board's longest-serving member. Minimum 120 days, Norman replied. Potentially 6 to 9 months if DoD questions our ability to maintain contracted service levels without designated personnel. You could feel the room temperature drop. 9 months without contract renewals would bankrupt Meridian Defense. Our entire business model depended on predictable government revenue streams. Rachel was completely trapped. Terminate my employment, and the company lost its DoD contracts. Maintain my position, and her narrative about transformational leadership change collapsed in front of the board that was already questioning her strategic judgment. There must be some solution, she said desperately. Some way to transition responsibilities without triggering federal review. There is, I said. Don't modify my employment status. William Montgomery leaned forward. Andrew, what exactly are you proposing? I'm not proposing anything. I'm simply clarifying that DoD takes personnel continuity very seriously. They don't care about our internal restructuring initiatives. They care about maintaining consistent service delivery from qualified, cleared personnel. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each board member. If leadership wants to implement organizational changes, that's their prerogative. But those changes cannot compromise our contractual obligations to the federal government. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Board members huddled together, calculating financial implications. Rachel stood frozen, finally understanding that her plan to marginalize me had just detonated in her face. Perhaps we should postpone organizational restructuring, suggested Margaret Chen. Focus on immediate DoD requirements. Agreed, said William Montgomery. Andrew, can you handle the Pentagon documentation? Absolutely, I said. I designed the systems they want to evaluate. As the meeting dispersed, Rachel approached me with the desperate expression of someone watching their career evaporate. Andrew, we need to collaborate here. The company's future depends on this contract. I nodded sympathetically. You're absolutely right. The company's future does depend on this contract. What I didn't mention was that I'd already determined what that future would look like. And it didn't include Rachel Montgomery. The Pentagon documentation submission went exactly as planned. I delivered 847 pages of technical specifications, source code samples, and architectural diagrams to Colonel Stevens on Monday, June 24th at 0900 hours. Every algorithm explained, every protocol documented, every security framework mapped to federal compliance standards. By 1500 hours, DoD had everything they needed to approve contract continuation. Colonel Stevens called Norman directly. Outstanding technical package. Exactly the kind of detailed documentation we require for classified systems evaluation. Rachel celebrated that evening with champagne in the executive conference room, probably already planning how to spin this success for the board. She had no idea what I'd been preparing during those same 72 hours. Tuesday morning, I called in sick. Instead of driving to Meridian, I headed downtown to K Street for a meeting I'd arranged the previous week. Patriot Systems Corporation occupied 8 floors of a glass tower near DuPont Circle, their cybersecurity division actively competing for the same DoD contracts we'd just secured. Anthony Rodriguez, Patriot's VP of Government Relations, was a former Marine colonel who understood both military culture and defense contracting realities. We'd worked together during his Pentagon assignment, back when he was evaluating vendor capabilities for Cyber Command acquisitions. Andrew, I have to admit surprised that you finally returned my calls, he said, standing behind a desk overlooking the Potomac, though timing suggests Meridian's having some leadership challenges. Circumstances evolve, I replied, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. What do you know about our situation? I asked. Anthony smiled knowingly. Enough to understand that Rachel Montgomery is discovering the difference between disrupting startups and managing defense contractors. Word travels fast in government contracting circles. We spent 90 minutes discussing Patriot's cybersecurity expansion strategy. They were positioning to compete directly with established firms like Meridian for DoD work. The challenge was credibility. Patriot had financial resources and corporate infrastructure, but lacked the technical expertise and government relationships that required years to develop. "What would it take to bring you aboard?" Anthony asked. I'd already calculated the numbers. Senior Director of Cybersecurity Operations, complete autonomy over technical personnel and contract relationships. I'd want to bring Alex Turner and 2 other engineers with me. Compensation expectations, $240,000 base salary plus performance bonuses tied to contract acquisitions. Standard federal contractor benefits package. Anthony didn't hesitate. Approved. Timeline for transition? I need 3 weeks to handle resignation properly. There are federal compliance requirements for key personnel changes that require careful coordination. What I didn't mention was that those compliance requirements were about to become Rachel's catastrophic learning experience. Wednesday morning, I submitted my formal resignation letter directly to Norman Price, as required for key personnel under FAR regulations. Not to Rachel, not to HR, but specifically to General Counsel for proper DoD notification. The letter was professionally brief. 3 weeks' notice, effective July 17th, citing career advancement opportunities. But attached was a second document that Norman would comprehend better than anyone else at Meridian. A mandatory notification to the Department of Defense that Andrew Hoffman, designated key personnel for contracts M2021-47, M2022-23, M2023-110, and M2024-31 would be terminating employment with Meridian Defense Solutions on July 17, 2024. Federal regulations were explicit. When key personnel departed defense contractors, all affected contracts entered automatic review status. Work could continue during review periods, but no new commitments could be accepted, and renewals were suspended pending capability assessment. The phone in Norman's office started ringing at 10:34 hours. DoD procurement officers had immediate questions about Meridian's ability to maintain contracted service levels without their designated cybersecurity expert. Questions that Rachel couldn't answer because she'd spent 6 months attempting to replace institutional knowledge with generational innovation. By noon, the entire executive team was in crisis mode. Rachel called my cell phone 17 times. I didn't answer. Brian Walsh attempted reaching me through Alex Turner, who correctly informed him I was unavailable for discussion. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. William Montgomery demanded explanations about why their essential employee was departing and what it meant for the company's primary revenue source. I spent Thursday afternoon packing my office and conducting transition meetings with my team. Alex Turner looked like he'd been physically assaulted. "Andrew, what happens to us?" he asked. "Half these systems require your authorization codes to modify. Document everything meticulously," I told him, "and polish your resume." Friday afternoon, Rachel found me loading final boxes into my truck in the parking garage. She'd obviously been crying, which surprised me. I'd expected anger or corporate threats, not genuine desperation. "Andrew, please, we can resolve this. Whatever compensation you want, title, equity, board position, just name your terms." I looked at her standing there in the parking garage of the company her father had built, finally understanding that some problems can't be solved with PowerPoint presentations and strategic consulting. "Rachel, 6 months ago you decided I represented legacy thinking that needed elimination," I said quietly. "Turns out I represented institutional capability that needed preservation. The mathematics of my departure were straightforward. DoD would require 6 to 9 months evaluating Meridian's technical capabilities without me. During that period, existing contracts continued, but no renewals could be processed. For a company dependent on predictable government revenue, it was a death spiral. 3 weeks later, Patriot Systems announced major cybersecurity contract acquisitions. Former Meridian clients, concerned about service disruption during extended DoD reviews, decided to diversify their vendor relationships for risk mitigation. Alex Turner joined Patriot as senior systems engineer 2 weeks after my official departure. By September, half my former team had followed. I heard Rachel lasted until the October board meeting when quarterly revenues dropped 43% and the Pentagon informed them that capability review would extend through Q2 2025. The board voted no confidence and installed an interim CEO with actual government contracting experience. Some people might call what I did revenge. I prefer to think of it as a market correction. Institutional knowledge has value that can't be measured in PowerPoint metrics or disruption narratives. When companies forget that principle, the market eventually reminds them. Rachel learned that lesson expensively. But education always costs something, and some lessons are worth more than others.